Hey everybody. Hello. Welcome. Can you guys see and hear me okay? Nice to see everybody. Hi Adina and Dawn and Shannon and Kathleen. Hello Samir. Hi everybody. Oh, my cursor's all at the bottom. Hello Liz. Liz, your comment is timed out from earlier. Sometimes they time out before we actually go live, I think after 30 minutes. So the first thing I see from you, Liz, is unavailable. It just says, Liz, unavailable. Hi, Gabriella. So I'm excited for this webinar. I think it's a great topic. I know a lot of you have requested this a whole bunch. So I'm really going to do a deep dive into this, especially for the anxious preoccupied today. Let me just make sure. You can repost it, Liz. I'll see it. Don't worry. So we're going to do a deep dive into limerence and some of the root causes and some of what creates limerence and what we can do about it. We know some of this for those of you who have attended the other limerence webinars. So in this webinar, we're specifically going to talk a little bit about sort of the overlap between addiction and limerence, OCD and limerence, some of these really key components that different individuals see. So before I dive into all this content for today, I am going to take some time and really go through some of these questions I have here from you. So Gabriella says, hello. Hi, Gabriella. So much shame around this. From 12 years to approximately 25 years, I used to obsess over guys I didn't know. I wouldn't approach him or know much about him. I could spend hours looking at his Facebook pictures, thinking about him. I talked to people about my crushes in school, and they think I was crazy. Got labeled a stalker, a crush on a guy lasting for 3 years that I didn't even know, except I saw him on the school bus. I'd get so upset if a guy or girlfriend expressed his interest in me for being weird because he didn't know me. Then I would find another guy and repeat the process. So this sounds more like the anxious side of fearful avoidant limerence, because there's this like quick getting over it and kind of moving on. And that's much more characteristic of fearful avoidant attachment style more than anything else. Then you say, I'm much better now. I'll engage with a guy I'm interested in. I'm wondering, what is it within myself that gets obsessed like this? I'm hoping these experiences will show me where I need healing. I hope this reaches you the past few times. I was too early or couldn't tag. Okay, so you're perfect timing for today. So what I want to talk about from the perspective of anxious preoccupied, I'm going to just start and dive into some of it, and it'll give you context into some of this specifically. And for the record, like, there's no judgment. Like, I see this stuff all the time. Like, limerence is a very common thing. Of course, there's like a frequency and it's, on a continuum, but this is something really normal for individuals with insecure attachment styles as a whole. So before I dive in, I do want to make a couple quick announcements as well. Number one, we posted the first webinar module, workbook module. So basically it's like myself and it's just the workbook and me going through every single exercise and giving examples that were either just of myself going through the exercises and things that show up for me. It was the personality needs course, or like really common examples that I see. And so I would love your guys' feedback, because we filmed a few, but before we post a bunch, I would really love feedback on like, was that thorough enough? It's pretty thorough. I think it's like 30 minutes or so, 35 minutes just on the exercises. But like, I would just love to hear, because we're going to film all of them for every single course. And I just want it to be like the best version of itself possible. So I would absolutely appreciate feedback. If you guys have a chance to dive in, go through that, check it out, leave feedback. That would be amazing. And you can leave feedback in the survey area of the members lounge. Also, I think you guys know the chat channel is up. In there, we have somebody monitoring it and just making sure it's everybody's respectful and kind. We also have people now monitoring the Facebook group on a much bigger basis. That was like me sort of doing it before with other team members, and now we have somebody assigned doing that to make sure everybody's respectful and kind and just regulating everything. What other exciting things do I have? We just finished filming the scripting course a few days ago, and it is very exciting. I'm very, very, very excited. We went through different scripts and models and things in the different 6 stages of a relationship. So that will be out soon, and I can't wait for you guys to see that. And if you are interested in the scripts, and we now have over like 50 scripts in there, it's like 6,000 or 7,000 words of scripts. Like it's like a little book. And if that's something you guys are really interested in long term, we've sort of given the early go ahead. It's in the early stages to hire actors to come in and really model out different situations, just so that people, like, and I mean, all sorts of different situations, like conflict resolution versus just communication scripts versus like all sorts of different dynamics you might see in dating and each of the 6 stages of relationships. Like we have a very creative video team, and they like really want to do this stuff and they can't wait. So let me know what you guys want to see more of. And I just appreciate feedback on an ongoing basis because it helps us keep like growing the school and adding really cool things to the school. So looking forward to that. Let's see. Yeah. So let me know what you guys think of that. Okay. So let's talk about anxious preoccupied here for a moment. And please feel free to put any feedback in the comments too regarding any of that stuff I mentioned, if you have any. Otherwise, check out the needs stuff and then leave us feedback after, please. Okay, so anxious preoccupied and limerence. A few characteristics I tend to see for the anxious preoccupied, and also this can take place for the anxious side of a fearful avoidant, is limerence happens more frequently to anxious preoccupied than any other attachment style. Now, the difference is that it happens more frequently, but it happens more flightily, if that was a word. It happens in a way where like anxious preoccupied tend to have limerence, and then they tend to move on to new things around limerence more often. And part of the reason for this is that anxious preoccupied, more than any other attachment style, are seeking themselves through others. Their subconscious mind, more than any other attachment style, is really trying to make itself whole through connecting in and through others, period. And a lot of what's gone on for an anxious preoccupied individual is that they tend to be so externally focused and so hypervigilant about their relationships, what people think of them. Think about this. Their core wounds are like, I'm excluded, I'm disliked, I don't belong, I'm not enough, I could be rejected, I'm unloved, I'm unworthy. Like these are all about what people think, right? And so there's this constant seeking of self through others. And there's this constant imbalance between inward focus and outward focus. And this is literally based on essentially trauma, the trauma of inconsistency. So, and usually keep this in mind too. If you were anxious preoccupied at a very young age, because there's a lot of inconsistency, especially between the ages of 0 to 3 years old, you're going to be a lot more anxious preoccupied, and there's a little more trauma that exists there because it triggers more of that biological fear of abandonment in the first 3 years than if you're anxious preoccupied because at 12 years old, your home life changed, or at 25 years old, you went through a relationship where somebody created a lot of inconsistency and suddenly you became anxious. Like there's a different imprinting that takes place at an earlier age versus a later age. And the first 3 years are the most impactful, followed by like the first up to 8 years, and then 9 forward still has an impact, but it doesn't compare to the first 8 years. And then the 8 years doesn't compare, 3 to 8 doesn't compare to 0 to 3 in the same way. And it's just because the subconscious mind is so much more suggestible. Those are the earliest experiences of attachment, what it means to attach. And there's a lot of research that backs this. So the anxious preoccupied, what takes place, right, is there's this imbalance between outward and inward focus. And what the anxious preoccupied really needs to learn is an ability to be with themselves, an ability to self-soothe, an ability to meet their own needs, to come to understand what they are, to understand their pain points, their triggers, and really like who they are at their core. And self-reflection and introspection are usually, it's so interesting, some of the things that I find anxious preoccupieds resisting the most, even though they love talking to other people about, some of their points and what they experience and their needs and what they're going through. But usually there's such a, if you could imagine a seesaw, it's just so focused on what everybody else is experiencing and not what I'm experiencing in my own internal reality if I were the anxious preoccupied person. So a lot of what creates, as Gabrielle is mentioning, a lot of what creates that limerence effect in anxious preoccupied individuals, or even fearful avoidance with a very strong anxious side, is the subconscious mind trying so hard to derive a sense of self, to derive a sense of certainty and security through a sense of self, an idea of who we are. And what the mind does is to try to define who we are. It tries to attach to relationships outside of it to try to give meaning and identity. And it's interesting because usually anxious preoccupieds have very strong personality needs around emotional connection, around social connection, around romantic relationships, around family. Like there's usually at least 2 of the 4 in the top 5 or 6 personality needs that are very strong for the anxious preoccupied. And that's wonderful. But if there is an imbalance of whatever those things meet for you as a human being between how you get them met outside of you versus inside of you, it creates inner chaos. So you want to imagine, for example, that if you're the anxious preoccupied and you want emotional connection, in order to properly receive emotional connection, and in order for that to be a two-way exchange of both giving your time, giving your presence, giving your connection, receiving connection at the same time, receiving presence, receiving compliments, receiving the expression of all different love languages, receiving intimacy, all of those things has to be the byproduct of somebody being rooted enough in themselves to be able to receive effectively. And this is something often that anxious preoccupied individuals also struggle with. And there's a deep, deep sense, though very, very hard to find because it's obscured by all of the opposing forces, there's a deep sense in the anxious preoccupied individual of also having emotional unavailability characteristics or qualities. And it's not through the desiring of, it's not through the wanting connection, it's not through the going after connection, trying to create connection. It's through the limited ability to receive connection back in a healthy and thriving way. And so this is because of like so much of that external focus. So these things are what need to be shifted and transformed. And we're going to go through some strategies for how to do this. We're going to talk a little bit about what happens and sort of some quick ways to fix limerence if it's like an urgent matter. So in terms of Gabriella and your question here, what I want to tell you is that when you have attachment trauma and when there's like a splitting that takes place within the psyche, a splitting off of like being able to connect to self, self-regulate, feel your own emotions, experience your internal reality effectively, the result of that is that you go into this like, oh my gosh, the subconscious mind needs wholeness, it needs equilibrium. So you go into this, oh my goodness, I need to get my needs met. It's like an urgent time. This has to happen immediately. So I'm going to hyper focus on how I can get my needs met outside of me because that's the only subconscious strategy I'm really familiar with. And so the byproduct of that, right, is that you go into a dynamic from 12 to 25 years old and you are seeking yourself in very specific ways. And like we've sort of touched on with the other webinars, the ways that anxious preoccupied individuals seek themselves is through, number one, the comfort zone of what love is. So if mom and dad, for example, were inconsistent, then somebody might express inconsistency in that 12 to 25-year-old period in your life. And you might be really drawn to that because that's a subconscious comfort zone. And your subconscious mind is actually like seeking that out to try to find a way to solve the problem somewhere and sort of crack the code to a certain degree. And so that's one way. A second way that you can experience, or a second reason anxious preoccupied individuals feel so attracted to others in a limerence type fashion is whatever unmet needs are so deeply unmet within you. And I want you to imagine, for example, that the brain is like, I need my needs to be met in order to survive. Like, I need my needs to be met for safety. I need my needs to be met for harmony. Like, I need my needs to be met for survival at a root level. And I want you to imagine that as you go into the different dynamics and relationships in your life, you're just not getting those things met. And then I want you to imagine that suddenly somebody meets those things for you. And it could even just be like your subconscious is building this massive framework, right? We always talk about how the conscious mind processes roughly 40 to 60 bits per second of information. Well, the subconscious mind processes up to 1 billion bits per second of information, and even more for shorter periods of time. And so if you're in a situation or a dynamic where somebody and something they do gives your subconscious mind this belief or awareness that somebody could meet a need for you that's being so unmet in your life, then your subconscious mind is going to beeline for that and like really try to latch onto that and really do whatever it can to try to bring that thing close to you so that you have a strategy for getting those needs met that you're hungering for so badly at a deep level. And that hungering is like homeostasis equals survival, equilibrium equals survival, equals safety. And so if somebody expresses a trait that's really repressed in you, that brings us to our next point. It's not just the needs, but it can also be if you're repressing something and that person is the expression of something you've disconnected from in yourself, you've repressed in yourself because you've made this trait unsafe or you think that the trait is bad or whatever it might be, then again, our subconscious mind tries to become whole through other people. And so it deeply seeks those things out and hungers and lusts after them. And these are the dynamics that create limerence. And something that's really interesting is limerence is in some schools of thought, some psychologists, some different individuals who just study limerence talk about how limerence is essentially a combination of OCD and addiction. And I wouldn't personally quite go so far because, again, limerence is like a continuum and that's not the case for everybody. That's the case for more extreme cases of limerence, in my opinion. But if you look at what addiction is, if you take limerence into the perspective of addiction itself, like we always talk about, and we talk about this in the addiction course, like the problem isn't the problem. Like it's not the person that's the cause of the addiction. It's whatever needs healing in you that is seeking something so desperately because it associates at a subconscious level that thing as getting very important needs met that are a necessity to your survival. And that's why addiction feels so hard to break, because usually there's a component in there, believe it or not, that the mind is actually linked to safety, to survival, and it feels like life or death to a certain degree to be able to give something up that you've attached or associated as being something that fills that cup for you. And so what limerence is a result of is literally trauma and a disconnect within ourselves, a splitting off from all of our traits. Some of them we've repressed more into the deeper subconscious or unconscious mind. And there's other components where it's like, there are needs that are so unmet. And we talk about, in Dr. Gabor Mate's words, he says trauma is something that happened that shouldn't have happened, like physical abuse, for example, or something that didn't happen that should have happened. And this can be where like the nurturing of certain needs can really come into play. It's like if you didn't have emotional nurturing in your early years, you might be really attracted to somebody who's warm, who's nurturing, who's supportive, because this represents something that you at some point in life went, oh my gosh, I'm not getting emotional nurturing and attunement. And that's tripping my biological fear of abandonment. And I'm not sure if I'm going to stay safe. And the moment you get little bits or breadcrumbs from anyone, a caregiver, a distant family member, a friend in the home, whatever it is, the moment you get breadcrumbs of attunement and supportiveness, it's like, oh my gosh, this is making me feel safe. I've been hungering for this. And then you carry that on. If there's still a programmed void because there was a lack somewhere growing up, if you carry that on and then you go into your adult romantic relationships and somebody represents those things, oh my goodness, it's, huge space where limerence can occur. And so this is what is happening when this is all taking place. And this is what we want to be aware of. So a way of really finding out specifically, irrespective of attachment style, but if you're really trying to find out, like, why did I experience such strong limerence? Like, what was this all about? What you can do is you can sit down and you can write out, what were the qualities of those people that I was in limerence with? What were the traits within them? And what did that represent that was broken or unhealed within me? And I don't want to say broken in like, people are broken. It's more like disconnected. Like, people are not broken. People have like repressed traits and they've sort of pushed parts of themselves away or hidden parts of themselves because they think they're not acceptable or things like this. So we really want to like look at it from that perspective, number one. And number two, ask yourself, what needs did I either get met through this person or did I think I was going to meet through this person? And what does that say about what needs were not met in my life, in the relationship to myself? And what can I do about this? Okay, what does that say is important to me that I need to show up for differently? And these are the types of conversations or introspective activities you want to be doing to understand the root cause of limerence. And again, you can think of like limerence or extreme infatuation or crushes as being a feedback mechanism about like what is important to you, what is valuable to you. Okay. And, traits, like when we have repressed traits, it can also be traits that we're not owning. It doesn't have to be like actually repressed traits, like things that we're not accessing. It can be things we're not seeing. So let's say, for example, that you grew up and you felt not good enough. And let's say it not good enough at social interactions. And then let's say as you got older, you actually like really developed that and you became really great at socially interacting and felt quite comfortable. But if you are still carrying this belief about yourself because of that old story of yourself in your subconscious mind, then what you're likely to do is get into a dynamic where you're telling yourself the story that, oh, I'm not that great at socially interacting. And then maybe you see somebody who you think of as being really charismatic and you're like, wow. And maybe you're just as charismatic, but there's a lot of individuals who express traits very strongly who don't see them because the story of themselves that they're carrying subconsciously conflicts with that, and it prevents them from actually owning the trait in full. And so that can be another sort of component or version of how this can take place. So I'm going to dive into some of these questions here for a minute, but there's a lot more to say about this specifically. So Jen says, hi, Thais. Hi, Jen. Next year, I'll start to date again. I set a boundary to go slow. I'm so fearful of limerence as an FA that leans AA. How do I move forward without sabotaging? Okay, so I'll give you guys a quick fix. Like if anybody's struggling with limerence and they're like, oh my gosh, this is actually causing a negative impact to my life, and I notice that I'm struggling with limerence, something really valuable you can do is you can just look at traits. Like one of the first things that we sort of feel so drawn to are our individuals' traits, right? So what you can do is you can make a list and you can write out like what are the traits or qualities that I'm so attracted to in somebody else, and what are the downsides of those traits. And what we really want to be doing long term is we want to like own the traits that we see. We want to see that we have those traits. We want to create a sense of wholeness within ourselves at a subconscious level through understanding and accepting that, hey, we also have those traits that we're infatuating with. However, sometimes people will get in a space, like let's say something I'll see often is like people come in and they're like, I've been in limerence for so long. I've been in limerence for 6 months. One of the questions I answered in a recent video that we have to post in the Ask Thais discussion forum is like somebody said, can I have limerence with somebody I've been broken up with for 6 months and I just can't get the person out of my head? And like sometimes limerence can be characterized as sort of like intrusive thoughts as well, like almost like you can't stop thinking about a person and you feel like you don't have control over that situation or dynamic. And so in that case, you really want to do the work to really uncover like what's there. What am I trying so hard to get through that person, or what am I trying so hard to connect to within that person that is obviously lacking in me? And so that's the end goal, is to be able to like recognize those things and then take ownership of what those traits are. However, if you're just struggling and you're like, okay, it's been 6 months, or this person's expressed they're not interested in me, and yet I keep like trying to connect with the person, I keep trying to see the person, and it's like destabilizing to your life, what you can do as a quick fix is to write out all the positive traits, and in a column next to it, write out all of the reasons those traits aren't so positive about that person. So for example, and it gives you a balanced perception. I won't even say it's like a bad thing to do. It's just not the ultimate goal. So let's say, for example, the traits in a person that you're really interested in are, charisma. Okay, so great. I'm really drawn to that in this person. What are the downsides of this person's charisma? Oh, well, they become so charismatic and then they are very flirtatious with everybody and it makes me feel unsafe. Or they are so charismatic, but they're really full of themselves, and that egotisticalness provides a barrier to deep connection, because the person's really interested in themselves instead of an energetic exchange in a relationship. So what you want to do really is like get clear about the downside, so you're not looking at a person through a one-sided story of them, through like through just rose-colored glasses. And you can do that by actively looking for the downsides of the person in a relationship dynamic, and that will help to balance out your perception. And obviously that perception is what is eliciting those emotional responses that can be kind of addictive in the first place. Okay. And something that's interesting too is like I've often seen, and we're doing the overcoming loneliness and the steps to connecting with anyone course, and a lot of not a big portion, but a decent part, like sort of a full module of that course, it's all about oxytocin and the impact of oxytocin. And there's a lot of research that says that, hey, oxytocin can be borderline addictive for some people. And oxytocin like has such a positive impact on so many areas. It sort of simulates like a serotonin response combined with a dopamine response when we're really getting a lot of it. And Limerence creates an oxytocin response. Like and oxytocin is like the bonding neurochemical, but it's also a feel-good neurochemical. And it's correlated with inhibiting cortisol and norepinephrine, which are like stress-based neurochemicals. So it creates like a feeling of like, if I've heard so many people talk about people when they have limerence, and if you can hear them, they say things like, oh, I can't stop thinking about them. Like, it just feels like life is more exciting. It feels like, and it's like all these things that they're experiencing that are so good and warm and fuzzy. And that can actually be a filler, right? That can be, hey, I'm trying to get these needs met because I'm not getting enough of this in my life. There's something I'm running away from, like chronic stress, like not wanting to look at myself, like not wanting to be in a relationship to myself, self-reflect, process my feelings, feeling bored in my life. And this person creates excitement, feeling like there can be so many different dynamics. And this is what you want to discover. This is the point. So Samir says, hi, everyone. Can AA have limerence towards DA? Absolutely. Usually, anxious preoccupied have the most limerence. Well, I'd say DAs and FAs in different ways, because FAs sometimes have that like presenting of emotional availability because they can be very emotionally available, but then it's really inconsistent and intermittent. And so that can create like a lot of confusion and challenges for the anxious preoccupied. But then the dismissive avoidant tends to reflect the traits that are most needed to integrate in the anxious preoccupied. So, the dismissive avoidants in an anxious relationship to themselves, basically, they're like always focused on themselves, their own boundaries, their own needs, because they had to become that way out of like, self-preservation. And so they usually are in this like sort of, I need to look out for myself. And this is the exact opposite of what the anxious preoccupied is. And that's what they need to work on. So this often takes place and is so important to integrate specifically. So they're like a drug to me. Yeah. And there's a big correlation between literally this stuff and addictive qualities or properties of feeling this way. So Marta says, hi, Marta. Let's see. Hi, Thais, new member, loving the courses. You mentioned in a past video you lived in Etobicoke, Parkland and Lakeshore. Used to live at Bloor Islington, moved to Montreal for a year ago. I saw your dog wearing a Habs shirt. I actually didn't move to Montreal. And everybody gives me a hard time about him wearing that, but he gets little allergies in the summer. And so we didn't want to put like him in a hot sweatshirt. So we put a little like t-shirt. It was the only one that we could find that was like thin enough. And it just happened to be a Habs jersey. So funny. But yeah, I lived in Etobicoke. I live in Innisfil now. But I lived there for a long time and it's a wonderful area. And Montreal's beautiful as well. So funny, eh? And small world. So Brittany says, hello. Hi, Brittany. Jermaine says, he says, hi, Thais. So if a person finds they're a target of someone's limerence, wow, what's the best way to let them down or end the situation? Also, what separates limerence from psychotic behavior? Example, stalking, intense obsession, etc. Okay, so number one, it's really, so think of limerence. If you can think of like, what is limerence based off of? Think of limerence being based off of these core things. Number one, limerence is based off of somebody seeing exclusively positive traits and not seeing the downsides of those traits. Number two, those traits themselves are usually a reflection of things that are repressed within the self. So somebody is really good with their boundaries. Oh, I'm really struggling with my boundaries, that sort of thing, right? So it's a reflection of things that you need to integrate or heal. It's the golden shadow, right? From shadow work. Number three, sometimes you can actually have those traits, but those traits are not, you're not acknowledging that you have them. Okay. And so maybe you are good with your boundaries, but you spent your whole life thinking you weren't. And so you infatuate with people who are, but usually that's a more minor infatuation. Number 4, it's a subconscious comfort zone. Usually individuals struggling with limerence also have some kind of subconscious comfort zone that's being reflected. And number 5, this person either meets the needs that are really unmet in your life, or promises to meet the needs. They may not actually promise, but you might make some kind of association. So for example, you might see that somebody's really warm when you first meet them, and maybe that person is like warm, but maybe they are not vulnerable in relationships. Maybe they aren't warm specifically in romantic dynamics, but your mind has seen them as warm, and they're like, oh my gosh, this person must be so supportive in a relationship. And so the person infatuates with that promise of how a person could be. And this is largely because the brain's like an association making machine. So you want to have like those 5 pieces of awareness in terms of what limerence is made up of. And then what you want to do if you're on the receiving end of that limerence, what you definitely want to do is be able to look through like, okay, what are these core components? And what do I understand from this person's behavior that they are infatuating with in me, and how can I equilibrate that perception? And it doesn't have to be that you're actively doing it, but if you can, let's say the person thinks you're so charismatic, you could be like, yeah, I'm pretty charismatic until you spend 24 hours with me, and then I can be grumpy, or like, something like that. Now, if somebody's like in borderline, dangerous behavior, stalking, intense obsession, things like that, you don't want to be having those conversations really. You want to have more of a hard boundary, if anything else. But you definitely want to speak a boundary, say a boundary. Hey, I will not be interested. I'm telling you clearly I'm not interested. I need you to see that. Whatever you're thinking about, like, you want to have a really hard boundary, because honestly, some of this stuff can be dangerous. But what separates limerence from like really scary behavior is just where the person is on the continuum, right? Limerence can be like you're thinking about somebody 24/7 that you've been on 2 dates with, and you can't stop thinking about the person, and you like wake up and thinking about them, you like think about them all day, you're telling everybody about them, and it's like, hey, it's a little early, it's just date number 2. But that might be an expression of limerence on like one side. But if you're in a space where somebody is like all the way to stalking, stuff like that, that's just an extreme version of limerence. And that's when it really does become like sort of a almost like comorbidity of OCD and addiction to a certain degree, right? Like it's like literally romantic relationship addiction or love addiction. And so that's when there's a lot of deep work to do. And it definitely reflects, like when somebody's at that point, it definitely reflects like a very strong visual, or like it's just a very big sign that person's got some kind of big trauma within them at some level. And it's not to be like, oh, we want to have compassion for those people at the end of the day, essentially, because it's definitely a signpost of some kind of big trauma, but it's not your job to heal that person either. It's your job to set a boundary and stay safe, especially if you're experiencing something like that. So Brittany says, one of the guys I was dating, I think I had limerence with him. Yep, it's very common. So Adina says, hi, Thais. How to know if it's limerence you are feeling or feeling uncomfortable with your partner? Due to us repressing needs and losing feelings, I'm FA leaning anxious. So something I often see is it can be really, really common for individuals who haven't expressed their needs in a relationship and don't know what they need, because they sort of went in and maybe they didn't do a lot of self-reflection first. And so they get into a relationship and then they meet somebody else, a friend, a coworker, whatever it is. And that person is expressing traits that are repressed in the relationship dynamic, like that are not being met or discussed. And then that person feels so much limerence towards a friend or something like that. So if that's the case, you want to look for like what that is and really try to define it and understand it, or like isolate it, and then absolutely express that in your relationship. Hey, I want to let you know there's a need that I haven't been expressing. I'm not sure if I was aware that I had it until more recently. This is what it is. This is what it would look like to meet it, paint the picture so that they can understand. I would love to start it. When can we start meeting this need? And is there anything you need from me? And then see the need through and hold that person accountable. Those are 4 really important steps if you experience limerence to bring into this dynamic so that you don't end up having to, you can, if you're unhappy in a relationship overall, of course you leave. But if you are leaving based on one little thing, and then, I've seen a lot of people over the years leave relationships because, one person's expressing over here one trait that is really repressed in a relationship, even though the rest of the relationship has like all these other traits and qualities that are valuable and important to that person. And then they leave the relationship kind of like on a whim because they're going, oh my gosh, this person, they're so amazing. And they leave the relationship only to like enter into a new relationship and then be like, wait, there were all these things that I wanted over here, and there's only one thing here that's really working. And so we just want to be mindful of that and ask ourselves those questions. Okay. And I'm going to give you guys some self-reflection questions in this webinar. There's like 6 or 7 of them that are really, really important, specifically for how to define ahead of time what you need in a relationship so that you don't run the risk of these things happening. It's like, let me understand ahead of time what's meaningful to me in a relationship, what matters, what I need to communicate and express so that I can be clear. So, Uma says, I've been the subject of limerence several times. I used to cultivate traits just to be attractive. Looks, money, job, humor, flirtation, etc. I'd like to it would get my foot in the door, and it's flattering to be liked. I'd eventually want to be a human and not a fantasy, so I would deactivate to calm the tension. It never ended well. We might have been compatible if volatility was lowered. How do you address limerence, especially if they're hypersensitive to rejection? I try to de-emphasize interesting things about me, but that doesn't seem healthy either. I don't necessarily want to hide my job, money, looks, humor, etc. Okay. So this is a wonderful question. So what I would say, and this is something that's going to be really important, is limerence, if you are the recipient of it, right? If somebody is like, you're the subject of somebody's limerence, just like Jermaine was saying, another really great thing that you can do is you can just get seen. Okay. Like it's not about like, oh, let me repress myself, because then you move in the opposite direction. It's about, let me show all of myself. Let me show my flaws. Let me show my wounds. Let me show my fears. Let me humanize myself by getting seen. Because at the end of the day, like, it doesn't matter, right? Who you can take the most like beautiful, perfect, successful, whatever person, but everybody has like an internal world. Everybody has, flaws or fears or like, vulnerable parts. And the more you humanize yourself, and you don't play, because I want you to notice something that happens here, okay? When you're trying to emphasize traits to win attraction, you're also not getting seen in your fullness, right? And part of like connection and honestly loneliness, because I've just been doing all this work on this course, but part of like loneliness and what creates loneliness is a lack of quality and connection. And a lack of quality and connection usually has to do with like, hey, what creates a quality interaction? People feeling fully seen, fully heard, fully understood, vulnerable, accepted for all parts of themselves, not just like certain parts that they're expressing and then other parts of themselves they're rejecting or repressing. And so if we have parts we're hiding and parts we're trying to emphasize, we are only allowing ourselves to receive love or connection through a mask. And as long as you're entering into that space and as long as you're like playing that sort of dynamic out, then you're likely to feel very often in a place where you might let somebody attach to you and they might be showing their parts, but you're not allowing yourself to organically or like vulnerably attach back. And then you feel like, oh, wow, this person's coming on really strong for me, but you haven't opened yourself yet to be able to connect. And then you feel the person come on strong and then you're like, oh, I have to deactivate, because it's sort of become a one-way relationship. Like, I'm being all on guard and like on my best behavior for them. And so it's not building an authentic connection. But when it comes to that person showing up and connecting to me, maybe they are doing that. And so they can attract to you based on the traits, but also like if you want to be mindful about not building a one-way channel of connection in relationships, which is often something that fearful avoidance do, because fearful avoidance, differently than other attachment styles, do tend to have this concept or idea that you have to have all these things to stay safe, right? Like a lot of fearful avoidant behavior is actually motivated by safety. And it's more unconscious. It's harder to find. But like, maybe you have to have a successful job just to stay safe because you feel like you can't rely on anybody. Maybe you have to look good so that you don't get bullied or, things that make you feel unsafe in your peer group. Maybe you feel like you have to be humorous to get love and to attract people in love because you feel like you have to earn your worth. And, without my earning of my worth, I become unsafe in the world because I can't depend on anybody unless I'm earning my worth in a relationship dynamic. Like there tend to be a lot of things like this for fearful avoidance. So you just want to be mindful that you build a two-way street. And then if you're the subject of somebody's limerence and you don't like the person, then you also want to be able to have a really strong conversation where you get seen fully. Like you want to be able to say the best thing you can do is set the strongest boundary possible if you think somebody has limerence towards you and you're not interested. And I don't want to be all like fear mongering here, but I have seen a lot of interesting things over the years where people can do things that are questionable, like, that somebody on the receiving end of limerence, knowing that somebody had limerence towards them, might have felt a little bit afraid by. So I would say if you think that somebody has limerence and you don't have any interest in that person and you think that person might have strong limerence, you're probably only really getting a portion of what you think it is. And I would definitely recommend just setting the strongest boundary possible. I'm not interested. I would really like you to please respect my space. Please don't ever call me again. Please don't look at my social media profile. Please, I would really set a strong boundary and get the message across as clearly as possible. And usually that works really well for anxious and fearful avoidance. Dismissive avoidance are the one that you set the boundary, it doesn't tend to have the same empowering impact as the fearful and anxious. So Thad says, as an AA, I have heavily been in limerence in the past. After doing PDS and self-healing, I find myself more with DA tendencies as I get back into dating, almost to protect myself and the work I put in. Is this a normal part of the healing process? Yes. This is a question in the lounge that I just filmed an answer to the other day too. Yes, absolutely. And I want to I want us to think of like a point of reference. Okay. So if your point of reference, Thaz, has been that like relationships are about giving all of yourself, of not having boundaries, of basically loving through a filter of codependency, then when you suddenly are healing and wanting to have non-codependent relationships, like healthy interdependent relationships, your reference point of comparison might make it feel like, oh my gosh, I've become super dismissive avoidant all of a sudden. But what it usually is for each individual is that they're actually just breaking codependency. It's actually just that you're not loving or seeking from a codependent space. And so usually that non-codependence is anytime we have fragility, right? If you were having an experience of fragility when, like, let's say there was you lost a family member or a friend, or there was some kind of like trauma, you would take your time and you would look out for yourself and you would protect yourself going into dating. You would make sure you're ready. You'd take yourself into consideration. You'd look out for your boundaries and needs. And as you go through this awareness of your attachment style and healing and start doing this work and you start to build this momentum, it develops that sort of same protective mechanism. Like, ooh, I have to take care of myself and look out for myself and be extra careful with my boundaries and extra like hesitant to not jump into something. And so the combination of that natural thing that's taking place, which is a very good thing, combined with this like reference point of, oh, I used to love codependently and now I'm loving interdependently, or I'm showing up interdependently, compared to codependency feels very dismissive. And then with that fragility you're taking into consideration and showing up for and just being protective of yourself, which is a natural and healthy human thing to do in this situation, it can feel like, wow, I've become dismissive avoidant, but it's actually a really, really fantastic sign. And I don't really think I've seen anybody who was pretty strongly one attachment style on the either anxious or fearful avoidance, not feel like they became dismissive for a while during their healing, but it does come back and absolutely balance itself out. So great questions. Hi, Annette and Shannon and Tiffany. So Annette says, hello, I can't stay for the webinar, but wanted to post a question to check on later. How can the partner of an AA tell if their AA partner actually has feelings or if it's limerence, or does it matter? I.e., how to tell if the person loves you or is in love with the idea of being in love. This was something I wondered with my ex, who was mainly AA, and although part of it is probably my own wounds, feeling unlovable, not allowing myself to be completely seen, I also wonder if part of it was my spidey sense about him being more infatuated with the idea of me than the actual me. He had lots of brief and flighty crushes before our relationship, and I'm trying not to make stories about what that means about our relationship. How can you tell the difference? And is there anything we should do or could do in that situation as the partner of an AA? Wow, great question. So a couple things. Limerence can be with you, not the idea of you. Like somebody can see you and be like, wow, you express the ability to meet all these needs that I have deeply unmet. And so you can enter into that space where you're like, oh my gosh, I'm really feeling this way towards the actual person. Okay. Now, the part of limerence that becomes unhealthy and I don't want to say scary, but not very good, is the part where the individual who is in limerence gets so attached to this idea of you that they come to expect you as that at all times. Not like, let's say they're the nurturing traits you have, the awareness you have doing this work, whatever it is. Like, let's say those traits, you're still a human, and human beings express all different traits all the time. So you're not going to be exclusively expressing those traits that might be a fundamental part of your personality, but somebody could attach to something that isn't going to be who and how you are 24/7. And limerence comes with a lot of expectation, and limerence is also a sign of dependency, not interdependency in a relationship. And so the things you want to be mindful about here are, how do we get back to healthy interdependency? So, for example, is that person expressing their needs? Is that person stabilizing their sense of self so they can bring a whole sense of self into a relationship? Is that person, and by the way, Thaz, good job, because you're bringing your whole sense of self, going from anxious, preoccupied. That's a reference point of a lot of healing, by the way. So is that person bringing their whole sense of self into a relationship dynamic? Is that person going to communicate their needs, or are they going to have me on such a pedestal that they're not going to communicate and express their needs to me? And then one day they're going to blow up or get angry over something that really I couldn't have seen or predicted. So those are the things, like, you want to make sure the person's communicating, expressing their needs, not putting expectations on you of being like these wonderful traits of yourself all the time, like making space for you to be a human being. And I would also say some other really important components is, does this person know how to set boundaries? Does this person know how to meet their own needs? Not just see them and know what they are and express them, but also meet them themselves. And those are the things that you really want to touch on, so that you avoid like somebody trying to love you in a codependent way while you're trying to have healthy interdependence, because obviously there's going to be friction there. So great question. Let's see. Yeah, so Jen says, Thais, I live very much in my head of fantasizing about the best connection, the greatest relationship. How can I heal this pattern? This is usually a sign that you feel whatever we ruminate about is also a subconscious strategy the brain uses to try to get its needs met. So this is also usually a sign that like you have unmet needs in this area. Then it can be extremely beneficial to sit down and be like, when I'm fantasizing about something consistently, what is my brain really interested in? What is it fantasizing about? What are the specific things? Is it because somebody could fantasize about singing together with a person because they love singing and it's emotional connection, romantic relationship, and creativity or self-expression. Somebody could fantasize about playing a sport with a person. Somebody could fantasize about working in a business with a person. Somebody could fantasize about having deep emotional conversations. So what you're fantasizing about is a reflection of unmet needs in your life relative to how strongly your brain values that need. And so you want to identify it, isolate those things, the patterns in your fantasies, and then try to create active strategies to get those needs met on a regular basis now. Great questions. Hi, Fioraya and Tiffany. So Tiffany says, I'm AA. I'm pretty sure all of my relationships since college started from limerence. Let's see. Started from limerence. I don't see another part of the question. I think you're just saying that. So I think that's probably the end of it then. Yeah. Most of your relationships started from limerence. I would say if somebody is secure with anxious edges, they're probably going to experience very little amount of limerence. If somebody is rooted in anxious preoccupied and they're even like, very maybe more severely anxious preoccupied or more intensely anxious preoccupied, like if there's a stronger expression of that in their personality, chances are that most relationships started from limerence. I would say anxious preoccupied, if you're very anxious, chances are a lot of your relationships are sort of in that area. Fearful avoidance are interesting with limerence. They can either have like limerence all the time, or they can really be in modes where, not all the time, I would say less so than anxious preoccupied, but it can happen. And when it does happen, it can be strong. But also fearful avoidance can be very shut down for long periods of time, even more so than dismissive avoidance, but only specifically for the reason that dismissive avoidance tend to have limerence with fictional characters and things that are like safe. And think of how this impacts our adult relationships in real life too, right? Like a lot of dismissive avoidants are more likely, as a general rule, to infatuate more strongly with people who do not threaten them. And so this can be like a lot of dismissive avoidant relationships start off as long distance relationships. A lot of fearful avoidant relationships start off as long distance relationships. Like these are important things to be mindful of at the same time, because they're ways that the brain gets its needs met through the promise of what could exist in that relationship dynamic. So Dawn says, hey, Thais. Hi, Dawn. Just wanted to say you're a wonderful light in the world. Thank you so much. And I appreciate everything you do. Thank you, Dawn. That's so sweet. Hi, Princess Khan. And Shannon. So Shannon says, I've noticed I'm constantly trying to live up to an ex, even though we haven't talked for years. Mentally, I feel like I still have to prove myself to this person because I felt so much like I was not enough to her. And she had traits or qualities that I wish I had. Consciously, I can identify, good job, what I'm doing, and that this is connected to my feelings of limerence towards her. But I still sometimes have this urge. How do I stop it? Okay, beautiful. So sit down, get a piece of paper, and write out, okay, what are the qualities or traits that I am trying to express in myself, okay, to meet this person's needs, right? And there's two interesting components in here. Number one, what do I believe, like, or why do I believe it's important to have these traits? Like, what do I believe will happen if I integrate these traits? Is it that then my brain goes, then I'll get to be with this person and she'll bring me X, Y, Z, right? What needs will she bring? That your brain is like, let me get these traits so I can get in this relationship, so I can be with this person, so I can get my needs met for this, this, and this. What are those needs, right? Because that's the end result that your brain keeps seeking out. And I would also ask yourself, why am I exclusively seeing those traits as positive? Like, what are those traits that I'm seeking and I think I have to have, but what are the downsides of those traits? Because those traits might be beneficial sometimes, but not all the time. And it sounds like you've sort of like imprinted her perception or her onto you as like what's good. And I would look for like whatever downsides might exist there, so you're not seeing through a one-sided perspective. Great question. And it's really great that you're aware that you're doing that, right? And notice, the last thing I want to say there too is notice that when you're in that train of thinking, when you're in the thought process of, I'm not good enough, and I need to get this trait, or I need to be better, you're actively diminishing yourself in that cycle. You're actively telling yourself, I'm not good enough and I have to access these traits to get better. And so just notice that you keep the not good enough patterning alive through striving. Because if somebody else was telling you, strive and fix this and change that and do this trait, or, express this trait, the act of doing that would be somebody saying you're not good enough. So you're still running that cycle in relationship to self. And that's important to recognize as well. What are the key differences between limerence for an FA, meaning anxious, and limerence for an AA? Are there any noticeable differences? Yes, beautiful. So noticeable differences. FAs tend to experience limerence less often. When they do, it tends to be sometimes stronger, because usually, not always, but often, fearful avoidants do have like deeper voids, you could say. So, because there's usually fearful avoidants are associated with more trauma. So it usually won't be like, oh, just a little void of safety. It'll be a huge void of safety, or, and so think of like the degree of limerence is likely to be relative to the degree of the void on the other side. They have like an inverse relationship. So if somebody's expressing this trait 10 out of 10 that you're missing 10 out of 10, you are likely to get somebody in severe limerence. Now, maybe not just from one trait, but if you have multiple traits or multiple needs, they're going to be exactly correlated, right? So fearful avoidants are likely to experience deeper needs around limerence, okay, like have deeper feelings or voids, so it can create like stronger limerence. But also fearful avoidants, when they feel rejected in any form, are likely to lose limerence really quickly. They're likely to like shut that limerence right down. If they're getting some kind of intermittent reinforcement, it can keep the limerence alive. But because fearful avoidants are so wired for self-protection, if they feel like limerence has happened, they've expressed interest, and then somebody shuts them down, they often turn around and they are able to shut down their feelings very strongly. Whereas anxious preoccupied, they don't tend to have that so much. They can sort of have limerence in a lighter, flightier way, like have all these like crushes all the time on people. And then when somebody doesn't seem like it's available to really meet their needs fully, they often then get limerence for somebody else somewhere else. And you can think of the anxious preoccupied as having more sort of like a less strong sense of self, and they're trying harder to derive their sense of selves from outside of them, right? Their sense of self is usually based on their relationships a little more than the fearful avoidant. And so you'll see like more limerence happening more often, but not necessarily as strongly, if that makes sense. So great questions. Kathleen, hi Kathleen. Kathleen says, hi everyone. I think I have a long time pattern of limerence in relationship, hoping to learn how to embrace balanced, normal love rather than viewing it as not enough when the highs are done. This is a beautiful point. So sometimes individuals who experience limerence will also go on to think, well, love is limerence. Like love is supposed to be this high. And when there's a high, now limerence is often characterized as like pre-relationship. And it can be like, in an early period of getting to know somebody or in the first couple dates. But something that's really important to note is that if you're in a space where you're in limerence in your relationship, so you're going from dating phase to dating phase of relationship, just like in limerence, then it confuses your concepts and ideas for what love is. But there's usually a really strong association with codependency in there as well. So usually there's some kind of like, oh, love is codependency, or I should love codependently, and that's how we get our needs met. And yes, there can be highs, but the thing I always say is that as we become more healed, more open, more receptive, feel more grateful, more at peace, more balanced, fulfillment in relationships always overpowers and outweighs pleasure seeking. So the highs and lows can go like this, but they can get capped, right? Like you can only go, 10 out of 10 or a negative 10 out of 10. But when you're entering into healthy relationships, it's sort of like that has no glass ceiling in terms of its capacity to grow and feel fulfilling and peaceful and all those sorts of things. And so initially, a lot of people who experience limerence, when they get into new relationships, if they're healing and they're not having as strong of a degree of limerence, can be like, oh, this isn't like, what I'm used to, or it's supposed to feel like more of a high than this. And there can be some confusion, but it's actually a good sign. And try to seek fulfillment feelings in a relationship, like peace, expansion, support, growth, connection, presence. Like these things are healthier sort of ingredients that lead to a thriving relationship long-term. Often limerence-based relationships are associated with trauma bonds. So great share. Hi, JJ Young. Newly discovered FA here, realizing that I need to utilize a little bit more of my dismissive side. Beautiful. And that will be like your boundaries, your sense of self, like knowing who you are, allowing yourself to take up space. And a huge component that's like linked to that and limerence is best overcome the more you're in a space where you allow yourself to take yourself into consideration every single time you make a decision. So not like, oh, let me just make a decision. And like, let's say, for example, you're in a space and a family member's like, hey, I'm going to go back to school. can you help me pay for school? And maybe you have $100 in your bank account. And you try to come up with money or all these different, you have to be able to sit with yourself and go, what does that look like for me as a human being? Like, does that work? Is that functional? Or is that sacrificial? And as we start to make these decisions where we take ourselves into consideration, long term, we are able to give more freely, not give from a space of sacrifice, give from a space because you have your things in order and you've expanded and you've grown and you've taken yourself into consideration and you haven't poured your cup out when it's already, close to empty. And then your cup is full, and then you can keep a full cup because you've got lots of supportive strategies and things you've done to keep, lots of things flowing into your cup. And then when you give from that cup, then it's easy to give from that cup. And then it feels empowering and exciting to give from that cup. It doesn't feel like, oh my gosh, I'm going to give some of my water away and then I'm going to be dying of thirst, right? And so part of and it sounds like, how is this related to limerence? But it's one of the most important things because it's the developing of the self-identity exists within the basis of being able to take yourself into consideration, check in with yourself, check in with your life, your goals, your feelings, your needs before you give. And that actually strengthens your self-identity, reinforces it. And a weak sense of self and a weak self-identity is directly correlated with limerence itself. So important points in there. So Uma says, I love having actors act out scenarios. Oh, awesome. Many of my peers and I don't have good modeling of behavior. Exactly. And I see people acting out like what they see on TV shows. And I want to point that out. Like, a lot of the ideas we have about relationships are from like movies, from like romantic comedies, from like somebody flies across the world on the last flight or shows up at the airport at the last minute to save like, these are not healthy concepts of relationships. And so it's really important that we have models for like what it means and what a relationship should look like and feel like. And so that really came to light with actually, doing the school, because just so much that I saw with so many questions and feedback was like, I don't know what a secure relationship is supposed to look like. I don't have, proper models of behaviors. And it's so true. And it's a really powerful thing to be focused on. So thank you for sharing that, because we'll definitely dive into that. So Ruby says, hi, Ruby. Do AA shut people off too, or push people back away out of fears and anxiety and looking back? Great question. So AAs tend to not push people away in a way that's deactivating. Sometimes they push people away accidentally, but usually it's for the purpose of activating. So for example, something from the outside. So let's say somebody's making somebody jealous in a relationship, okay? And let's say it's an anxious, making a dismissive, avoidant, jealous in a relationship, trying to like elicit a response, trying to create jealousy in a relationship dynamic. So when you look at that, you might go from the outside, whoa, they're trying to push the person away. They're trying to make their partner jealous to push the person away. But the sponsoring intention behind it is like, no, I'm trying to see that the person cares. So I'm trying to make this person jealous to see if they care about me in the relationship, because I'm not hearing positive reinforcement, or I don't know where we stand, or I'm trying to get closer in the relationship and feel valued, right? So there can be that version, but there also can be the fearful avoidant version, where a fearful avoidant might be deactivating and going, I'm going to show this person I don't need them. And so I'm going to make them jealous. And that's an act of pushing the person away and protecting the self, right? And so it's really like, what you'll see is that sometimes from the outside, it can look like an anxious, preoccupied individual is pushing somebody away, but they rarely are in a space of doing that. And if they are, it's for very short periods, like little tiny spurts, like 5 minutes. Like usually that mechanism kicks in if they feel a fear of disconnecting, and that mechanism kicks in, and after 5 minutes, they're already creating activating strategies. Fearful avoidance, for example, can, I thought you were comparing fearful avoidance for a second, but yeah, so usually it's for very short-lived periods of time. And something interesting too is like dismissive avoidance can have little anxious moments as well, right? But again, for much shorter periods of time. FAs leaning anxious can have much more strong deactivating strategies for longer periods of time and get more rooted in themselves and actually be trying to push somebody away. So yes, they can shut people out. Yes, they can have fears and anxiety, but usually it would be more like this. The anxious is trying to make somebody jealous to try to get a positive reaction or, create desire for them in a relationship. And then instead, let's say it's a dismissive avoidant partner, the DA is like, wow, this person's making me feel unsafe. They're flirting with other people or they're doing, X, Y, Z. And then they pull back and they want to protect themselves. And usually the pushing away was like actually an attempt to bring closeness, but it backfired. So that's what I tend to see there. Great question. Enner McFly, hello. What I think of as a spark seems to be limerence. I basically am not interested without this. How can we tell the difference between attraction and this? Great question. So attraction should feel like it's a beneficial thing, but not a destabilizing thing. Attraction should feel like, oh, it feels good to connect, or it's exciting, or it's fun, and should feel sort of fulfilling and beneficial, not all-consuming, not addictive, not obsessive, not destabilizing, not where like you start losing your sense of self, or suddenly like here you are thinking about this person nonstop and oh, you forgot to turn in your work for your job, you forgot to call your friend back that you really wanted to speak to. Like the moment it becomes destabilizing, that's where we get into a negative space. And again, anybody who's experiencing that, the person you're experiencing that around is just reflecting a pain point in you that's like a deep void that really needs healing. And so it's really like, okay, what needs is this person meeting for me that I'm so infatuated with? And where am I out of connection in meeting those needs in the relationship to myself? Or what traits is that person expressing? And where have I repressed those things or cut those things off within myself because I think they're unsafe or I think that they're bad? Okay. Or where am I not seeing myself fully and that I do have these traits and qualities? Okay. And so it's really about getting in there and seeing that. Or where is this a subconscious comfort zone? And if that's the case, then I have to be re-traumatizing myself in the subconscious comfort zone if it represents something painful. So if you're in limerence with somebody dismissing you and you're like, it doesn't feel good to be dismissed, that's not like a trait or a quality I want to work on. But I'm in a space where I keep dismissing myself. And so this feels like a subconscious comfort zone. And so I'm drawn to that in other people. Well, there you go. But that means that I have to break that re-traumatization pattern by actually showing up in relationship to myself and not dismissing my feelings, not dismissing my needs, not dismissing my boundaries, not dismissing what I desire when I make decisions that other people are involved in by just taking what they expect from me or of me, right? So those are the really important components to be aware of. So the next question is, what are the deep roots of inconsistent or unreliable parental love or safety that causes an AA not to learn to self-love? How is that a protective behavior? I'm having trouble connecting the two and understanding it as a whole. Yeah, it's a great question. So think about this. Usually there tends to be in the anxious preoccupied's life some element of inconsistency. So let's say either one parent was really loving and available and the other parent was really unavailable. And that created this like confusing mixed messages between the parents and the child's home. Or both parents are really loving, but they work a lot. And the child spends a lot of time with the grandparents or with a babysitter. And there's a lot of inconsistency. Usually what that creates is the child has built in not exclusively, but many more positive associations to connection to others. And that feels like a strategy to create safety, because the subconscious mind, one of the only biological fears we have coming into the world is the fear of abandonment. And that's because we're a social species. This is because children as human beings take so much longer to develop than most other mammals and are so much more dependent on caregivers in order to survive for a much longer period of time. And so there's this natural biological wiring and desire to connect to a parent because that is actually what is necessary to survive and to create safety. And so if there's inconsistency in there, the subconscious mind of that child goes, well, I'm getting positive feelings when I do connect, and people are safe because they are emotionally available. I've seen it, but either not everybody is, and that scares me, and that triggers this, like, am I going to be abandoned fear? Or both caregivers are safe, and I really love them, but they're not always there, and they come and go. And so out of that creates this, if you have more positive associations to emotional connection, and you feel like it's safe and you feel like it's your strategy to stay safe, then, and you have negative associations to being alone because you feel triggered and traumatized, and that fear of abandonment is like popping up and activated over and over again the moment that inconsistency takes place, then you enter into a space where the brain, in order to cope with that, goes, I'm going to super focus on anything I can do to try to maintain closeness in relationships. And instead of going into a space where it's like, oh, let me work to figure out how to self-soothe, or let me work, on meeting my own needs or developing a sense of self. Instead, it's like, no, let me derive everything from outside of me in order to get safe and become stabilized. And so as a result of that, the hyper external focus on everybody else is an act of not self-loving, and is the way that this individual loses relationship to self. So if you imagine, for example, that you have a partner and they are super loving to you and super available, and then they just shut off and they don't see you, they don't hear your needs, you're in the same room with them, they won't even look at you, they ignore you, you express emotions, they just like look away, you're in a room with people, they talk to everybody but you, that person's going to make you feel really unloved. And so that's what the anxious, preoccupied individual does in relationship to themselves as a byproduct of trying to survive and get safe because of the way those biological fears are programmed in. So great question, and I hope that makes sense. Can you be in limerence with the golden shadow you see in another? Yes. The traits I liked in him a lot were the same traits that are part of my golden shadow. Absolutely. And that's a really good example of like you having the traits, but not owning it. And so it's like you see them, and that will probably create more lower levels of limerence than extreme levels of limerence, because they are traits that you have some degree of conscious awareness that you have, but you haven't integrated your perception of the fact that you have them fully. So great question. Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry to hear that, Liz. And yeah, that will create a lot of that, right? So it's important to recognize like what you're likely to be infatuated with as a result of going through some of those challenges, like safety, consistency, trustworthiness, like these sorts of things you might have a lot of limerence in relationships. So if I'm worried about limerence while in no contact, should I ignore any attempts of connection by him to figure it out alone? I don't want to reject him if he does. I'm having trouble with traits. I know he's independent, but the biggest trait is probably that he's reserved, quiet, and introverted. How do you navigate limerence while in a relationship if it has become detrimental to the dynamic and causes codependency? What I would do then, this is like one of those emergency situations with limerence, where literally if you are just trying to regulate and get stabilized again, as you work to like incorporate the traits and balance out the traits or needs. And I would look at the needs part there a lot too, Princess Khan. But what I would say is that if you are in a space where you are feeling really drawn to these things and you're just trying to stabilize during this like sensitive time of the relationship, I would look at all the downsides of his traits. And I don't mean like for 10 minutes. I mean, like, do the work for an hour, like sit down, write all the things you like about him, all the qualities. Because if we're in limerence and if we're feeling like dysregulated and out of control behavior, we're probably having like a very exclusively one-sided perspective of this person. And it's critical thinking and critical self-regulation is obviously impacted negatively when you have really strong emotional feelings alive, right? Because you're more like in your limbic system than in your prefrontal cortex. And so you want to be able to like sit down and you want to be able to go, okay, what are all these traits and qualities that I'm so attracted to or missing so much or thinking so much about? And what were the downsides to some of these things? Like maybe he was really intelligent or really, whatever it is, but maybe that made him more exclusively focused on intellectualizing things instead of being fully emotionally available. Maybe, and you want to really work to balance those perceptions. And you want to do that with like as many things as you can. And it's just going to help to like equilibrate everything so that you can see. And the idea of what we want to see is we want to be able to recognize people's good sides and good traits and their downsides and the not so great traits. And we can say like, oh, why do we want to recognize people's downsides? that's a natural part of what happens in every relationship. The more you get out of the gates and you see people and you can accept those things early on, the easier of a time you're going to have in the power struggle phase of a relationship. Because like part of what creates such challenge in the power struggle phase is that people get into a relationship and they're like, wow, I'm so amazed with this person. And they see somebody so exclusively positively that the dating and honeymoon phase are like these highs. And then the brain's going to equilibrate at some point because those highs come with expectations. When we see somebody as perfect, we expect them to always be perfect. And then we can't handle their imperfections. It's like it crushes our perception of them and it creates an identity crisis in the relationship. And so it's really important that the idea and the goal of every relationship to get to the bliss phase should literally be to enter into a space where you're like, wow, this person has all these wonderful, amazing traits and qualities. And I see those things and I appreciate those things. And they have flaws. And these things have downsides. But I see those things and I accept them and I'm okay with them too. And so it's not like I'm in love with those things too. It's I'm accepting of them. I see the person as the whole version. And that's actually like unconditional love, is seeing things from a more fully oriented perspective, seeing the positives and negatives more equally and accepting the totality of a human being. And that's how you get into like healthy, thriving love. And that's what the life cycle of a relationship is naturally doing, is trying to get you to that point. It's trying to take you through infatuation, then the power struggle. You see the person's flaws, you recognize them, and you have to work to accept them. You have to work through them and express those things and hear each other out and do that work in that area. And that brings you into the stability phase. And then it's like, okay, now we still have to keep up with each other and we still have to, do things that keep the relationship and the excitement alive. And then that brings us into the commitment phase, where we then talk about like all these important things in a relationship dynamic, see each other more fully in our plans of the future, our desires, our fears, what we want to create for a lifestyle together. And then once we've seen each other in all of that fullness of the power struggle, the less exciting version of the person in the stability phase, and then the long-term vision of what that person is going to likely become or want to create. Once we've truly seen all the good and the bad, we enter into the bliss, which is more characterized by like real unconditional love. And so when we're in limerence, we lose that part. We lose those really important ingredients that are going to prepare us to be able to achieve a bliss phase in a relationship. And the more we can see somebody fully and from an integrated balance point of view, with their upsides, with their downsides, with their beautiful qualities, with their flaws, and accepting those things, that's how we're most likely to be successful long-term in a relationship dynamic. So great question. Yes, exactly. Gifty Fresh. I go into it in depth, the downsides of traits in the Anxious Preoccupied course. Good memory. Maybe you're doing the course right now, but great job. Thanks for sharing that. It occurred to me that this could happen to you. Have you ever had a client or student have limerence with you? I mean, I don't think so. I've had really strong boundaries with things. I think maybe like very minor versions of that, but I tend to have really good boundaries and I'm really clear with boundaries. And so if it's happened, it hasn't been in a way that's like noted, that where I've noticed or it's affected my practice or anything like that. But boundaries out of the gates really help with that. Like sharing, like, that you're in a relationship, or sharing like let's say, Jermaine, like if you're the subject of somebody's limerence right now, share, hey, I'm not interested, or like, this is my type of person. It's not, and share what that would be like. Help to paint the picture for somebody of why something wouldn't work or why you're not going to be interested in. Really, a lot of individuals, here's another really important component. Limerence also has to have some degree of hope. And people who are in limerence, the hope has to be there in some version. And sometimes it can be like in a version that's not reasonable, right? It could be somebody has, a husband or a wife and children and fully happy in their relationship and all these things. And the person's just finding hope because the brain is literally really, really, really trying hard to seek out those needs or to integrate those traits, and it doesn't have a better strategy. But the less hope that exists, the more likely the person is to be able to move on, especially if the person is more fearful avoidant or even anxious preoccupied. The next one, what if you don't want to believe the downsides of a person exist? I've just come out of Limerence, still recovering, and feel like I didn't want to believe anything bad about my other. I think that was the end, about my other. Okay, so beautiful. I laugh because this is a huge part of this. This is exactly like what goes on, and it's a beautiful discovery. I would ask myself, what need am I trying to get met by ignoring that this person has downsides? Because everything the brain does is a subconscious strategy to get a specific need met. So if I'm ignoring, like, limerence is painful a lot of the time, and it's hard to move on from, and it has a lot of downsides to it, and it prevents healthy relationship dynamics from happening. So what in you is trying to keep the limerence alive by exclusively seeing the person as positive? And write down that need and take some time to like sit with it, okay? And once you've figured out what that need, or it could be multiple needs, are, then create in like a column next to it a bunch of strategies to get that need proactively met in your own life on a regular basis yourself. And that's going to be the remedy for that situation. So great question. So let's see. So Thaz says, if you have sex early on and getting to know someone, can it make limerence worse because of all the feel-good chemicals that makes it seem more intense? Great question. Yes, depending on your attachment style. For some individuals, and depending on like what your belief patterns are, for some individuals, like dismissive avoidance, often if they have sex in a relationship before they feel safe in the relationship, they shut down even more. And they feel the need to push people away. That's not always the case, but it often can be. Some people sex is triggering for, right? Some people get upset about there's a lot of different dynamics. Then some people really get a lot of their emotional needs met through sex, and yes, then have really positive neurochemical reactions, right? So overall, I would say yes, there's a greater chance that does happen, but different attachment styles also do respond to that stuff quite differently. And it's more like the beliefs and thought patterns that are activated through sex, depending on the person, that will create the neurochemical output. So great question. That's amazing, Shannon. I love that. So Nellie says, it has been over 1 year since I found you on YouTube, and I just want to tell you that you've changed my life so much. I'm still growing and loving every minute. That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm so happy to see you. I remember when we did the live example, and I think probably soon after that you sort of like really got into questioning your thoughts, and you've done all that work. So congratulations to you, and thank you for sharing. The longer I go no contact, the more my self-esteem and confidence returns, and the less limerence I feel. Beautiful. Do you know why? Because your brain doesn't, when you're consistently making conscious decisions to stay no contact, and if you've ingrained like, enough emotional imprinting to see the positive reasons for why, then your brain stops holding on to that person as a strategy to get your needs met. Because remember, like the basis of limerence, whether it's through traits or whether it's through needs specifically, like different types of needs, it's all still rooted in needs at the end of the day. Like if somebody's expressing a trait that I have repressed, I probably want wholeness, which is still a need, right? And so so imagine your brain is this needs meeting machine, and then the more you go no contact, your brain starts saying, oh, well, that I can't get my needs met through that person because we're no contact. And then it looks for other strategies like yourself, like healthy people, like a dispersion of different ways to get your needs met. And the act of doing that diminishes limerence and is part of healing that pattern. So beautiful. Hi, Hungo. Yeah, so we decided to do the courses on scripting and overcoming loneliness first, but there is but then we did 2 webinars, maybe we have 3, I think 2, on limerence specifically. So we just did one on dismissive and fearfuls, and now this one on anxious preoccupied, sort of to substitute, but we also talk a little bit about limerence in the How to Heal from a Breakup course, so you can check in on that as well. So Deanna says, Adding to Thaz's question, can BDSM exacerbate limerence because of the level of vulnerability we experience through that kind of intimacy? Yes. I have worked with many people who have had those conversations or are doing things related to BDSM or practicing BDSM. And I definitely see, I mean, it's hard to say, right? Like, I definitely see a very strong correlation in the number of people I've spoken with who participate in BDSM and the patterns of limerence that come with it. So a huge correlation that I've seen, I would say, I'm not sure if I've seen somebody off the top of my head who practices BDSM and doesn't experience really strong patterns of limerence. And yes, vulnerability is a huge intimacy factor. But the reason I say it's hard to say is that it could also be if you really expand the situation, it could also be potentially that the need to seek out vulnerability to such a degree can also be correlated with trauma. And so it could be that people with BDSM also have some trauma in their background related to vulnerability, and then they're equilibrating from that at the same time. So it could be both, right? And I'm not saying that everybody who practices BDSM has trauma. Well, probably, because all human beings have trauma. But I definitely see a huge pattern of limerence, but it could be for different reasons, right? And so that's important to note as well. But I've definitely seen a lot of people have the conversation where it's there's so much vulnerability and there's so much open communication that's required. And I think vulnerability is something that every human being experiences a lack of and craves and seeks out in their interpersonal relationships. But most people just don't know how to achieve vulnerability or don't have strategies or tools or good modeling around that. So great question. Very insightful. So Nathan says, just want to thank you for making these videos. I've been watching your videos for 3 days now. Thank you guys. Thank you guys for all of your gratitude and stuff. It makes my heart really happy. And I super, super appreciate it. So thank you. Yeah, power vulnerability. Exactly. So Rizal says, hi, Rizal. I suffer from limerence over someone I know is not good for me. Given the intensity, I believe I'm an AA. However, I later got into a relationship with someone good and found myself turning into a DA. I'm always finding his flaws. What's happening? You are probably a fearful, avoidant, leaning anxious. And you probably are identifying more with your anxious side. And that could also be seemingly exacerbated or magnified by the fact that you might tend to be with more dismissive people first. And then the moment you're with somebody who's secure, then you might see more of that anxious side or that dismissive side coming up. So that's what I'm going to say is probably happening. And then I would just do a little bit of the work around fearful avoidance, especially if you notice that you have a lot of hypervigilance. I think this is important. Yeah. And Adina says, this is what I've been feeling this time, afraid to be seen as weak, so I can't be authentic in a relationship. The more we are not allowing ourselves to fully be seen, the more the moment somebody offers something like that to us, we're going to latch on in a way that can likely lead to dependence or imbalance. And so part of what we want to create and how we want to show up in our relationships is through the act of being able to actively be vulnerable as a human being, actively identify our needs and get them met from many relationships, so that we're setting the tone to not feel oh my gosh, we found one source of something that's in complete lack within us, and now we latch on there in a way that feels addictive or destabilizing. Yes, I love that. Jermaine says, this is how social media, especially Instagram, can trigger limerence because it shows the best or perfect photos. Exactly. Excellent. Great insight. That was a really cool share. So Erna says, one, struggle to apply advice here to my life with a disability. I have maybe 3 usable hours a day, and they go mostly towards self-care. So a lot of the showing up for self-advice doesn't have a lot of wiggle room. I don't have family, so I see that I may be looking to relationships to fill some of these needs, especially since I don't have have work, friendships, or really the ability to meet friends, etc. I've only just begun. Oops, the cursor just skipped way down. 1 second. Let's see. Oh, found it. The ability to meet friends, etc. I've only just begun to date and I'm taking a break due to COVID. Anyways, what advice would you give someone who has a lot of unmet needs due to disability, no clear way to meet them, due to the severity of that disability, and who wants to avoid limerence? Beautiful. So number one, I hear you, and I'm sorry to hear that you're going through different challenges, and definitely I will validate that your situation will be a lot more difficult or challenging than most people's. But I want to let you know, I want to think about this, okay? Let's take the version of like somebody who is a monk and they decide, I'm going to go live in an ashram or somewhere away by myself for long periods of time. And really it's like a form of self-isolation. And so, and sometimes won't talk to people and all these different things. And sometimes monks, and I've actually worked with clients who have been monks before and come back, say that was the most beautiful time of their lives. That was the most powerful time of their lives. And what's happening is that when they're in that space, they are like really, really getting their needs met from different things, right? Number one, self. And number two, and this will depend on people's belief patterns, but even if it's just a belief, even if no God or higher power exists, even just in the belief that it does and the showing up to appreciate, to worship, to commune, like all these different things, all of those things are acts of connection. And so what I would recommend is I would say you can fill your own cup, and we can really, really fill our own cups a lot more than we think. And so I would get really clear on like what those things are and how I can just super meet those needs within myself. And then if you do have a belief in a higher power or anything like that, it's a beautiful space to get your needs met for connection through prayer, through meditation, through any of that in like a spiritual context, not in a like self-development context. But either is beautiful. And then look for like, what are some extra creative strategies I have to come up with? Yes, it's going to be more challenging, but it's also a beautiful time to be really creative. Like, will I join more Facebook groups? Will I, and even if you don't have a lot of time, like you said, you only have a couple hours, like the act of taking ourselves into consideration, like checking in with our feelings and needs throughout the day is probably more important, if I had to say one or the other, than 2 hours of self-reflection. Obviously, the 2 hours of self-reflection long-term is going to super lead to that. But like, you can be with yourself all day long, and that's going to fill your cup. So you can show up, you can take your needs into consideration throughout the day. Hey, how am I feeling? What am I needing? What stories am I telling myself? Oh, I'm feeling off. What painful stories have I been running? What are my fears? What can I do to create resolution in those areas? And constantly checking in and showing up and being in relationship to yourself and conscious of yourself throughout the day is probably more beneficial than any time that you're going to spend in the evenings. Now, again, of course, spending that time long-term leads to that and leads to integrating that normally and naturally. But we can be creative here, and there's still room, even with only a little bit of time every day, there's still room to show up for yourself, to meet your own needs throughout the day, during that time, and to find creative strategies to get your needs for connection met in a variety of different forms. So thank you for sharing that. Awesome, Thaz. I'm happy to hear that. The movie Single White Female, great example of limerence gone too far. I haven't seen it, but it sounds kind of funny. How do we meet our need for emotional intimacy when we're single? I get this question so much, and it's a really good sign of people like being on their journey and showing up and doing the work. And really, emotional intimacy is about like closeness to self, presence with self. One of the biggest things that creates intimacy is like vulnerability, feeling seen, feeling heard, feeling, and there's a doctor that, his name is Dr. Daniel Siegel. He's an author as well. He has some really great books. I read one and a bit of one, 1 and a quarter of one. And he talks about attunement, and attunement's like a very known thing, but he kind of digs into it and like studies it a little more. And he talks about how attunement and intimacy is really about, do we see somebody? Do we hear them? Do we feel them? Do we understand them? Do we validate them? And I would say those are the exact ingredients we need to have in relationship to self. And a lot of those things can be achieved through, you feel bad, you pause, you try to figure out why you feel bad, you nurture yourself, you're compassionate towards yourself when you make a mistake. We don't beat up on ourselves or have a lot of self-criticism. We check in with our feelings and needs. When we do something wrong or silly, we try to humanize ourselves and we go, oh, what caused that? What was going on at a deeper level? Let me connect with that and try to work through that. It's all about like, am I showing up in a way that is making me in relationship to self feel seen, heard, validated, felt, understood, and what are my actions to do that? And you can do that habitually, or you can do that throughout the course of a day, but a combination of both is always the best. So great question. What happens when both people have limerence with one another? Looking back, hi Brandon, I see that both me and my DAX were both in that area. So when this happens, it's usually a very, very strong connection, but it can sometimes be a trauma bond because it comes with like all of those expectations. So if that happens, and a bunch of you might experience this, right? Like you guys might go into a relationship in a year and be like, honestly, probably a lot less so, because the more secure you become and the more regulated you become, the less ground you have. You're healing the trauma that's creating this stuff in the first place at the root level. So I guess that's not really true. But let's pretend that like you meet somebody and you experience extreme limerence, and that's what happens. So what you want to do in order to be mindful of this is you want to be able to go, okay, so I need to meet my needs. I need to show up and communicate. I need to keep my sense of self, even though I'm feeling this way. I need to be proactive at sharing my flaws, sharing the downsides to myself, and trying to understand those things about another person as well. And if you can do that, and you can keep getting your needs met from all 7 areas of life, you can keep showing up, still having a relationship to yourself, not exclusively going to that person to meet your needs. Know what your needs are on a regular basis. Meet some of those things yourself. Like all of those dynamics, you're going to be able to navigate that limerence so that extreme attraction or infatuation can actually turn into a really healthy, loving relationship. So great questions, you guys. Fantastic questions. Shut down if I felt vulnerable, then trying not strive and prove myself will shut down. Yeah. Sorry, I know you guys are chatting. You're welcome, Ruby. Is it limerence if you desire a partner who hurt you, but have a clear understanding of their negative flaws as well? Can it be limerence if you see their flaws and issues, or is it normally fairly universal positive view of the person? What I would say is it becomes limerence if the person's like unwilling to show up and you keep feeling that degree of strong feelings. And if the person's rejecting and not doing the work, and you keep like pining or moving in that direction, even though consciously this person's not interested, they're not going to do the work, they're not willing to show up. But either way, I would do a little bit of work around limerence, because even if it's just slight limerence, even if there's a degree of it there for you, Dawn, which I imagine there might be a little bit, even if that's there a little bit, doing the work on limerence will help you approach the entire situation from a more balanced, positive state, so that you're less likely to get dysregulated by any challenges in the person's behavior, which, because I know how challenging the situation likely is, will really help you to navigate it more effectively. And you need kind of all the tools and support you can get in there will be really beneficial right now. So great question. Limerence for 6 years. Good for you. If you recognize, JJ, that you have limerence for 6 years, sit down and do the work. Like there's going to be amazing stuff that you're trying to get through that person that isn't whole in you. And it's going to be so powerful to recognize exactly what that is. Let's see the next question. In terms of spirituality, do you distinguish between limerence and feeling drawn to someone for a higher purpose? If so, how would you explain this? I think drawn to someone this is a cool question. I think drawn to someone for a higher purpose, if that's like a valid thing, which, I can't know for certain, of course, but I like ideas like this. It will not feel obsessive. It will not feel destabilizing. It will not feel like it has a big downside, because any components, this is my take, okay? My take is that anything that you are over attaching to that's unhealthy attachment is based in ego, not based in something higher, right? Not like a your spirit or soul or higher self or anything like that, right? It's the mind that wants to latch and obsess. An initial feeling is one thing, but to attach, obsess, pine, all these things are usually ego-based due to voids within the personality structure. So great question. That's just a theory, though, of course. We can't know any of that stuff for sure. So Primer Dimers. Hi, Primer Dimers. Says, new and loving your content. Please excuse the typo errors as I'm trying to make the word count. Thank you for being here and for sharing. How to reconnect after it started out as Limerence. We don't have a foundation as friends. So I'd like to start there. Began as Limerence. He's FA. We dated 3 months. He went to voided and broke up. I'm trying to reconnect after 4 months, but he flaked 2 times when we were to meet up. Last text is me asking when and rescheduling, and he didn't reply. Any advice on how to approach the FA him? Okay, great question. So what I would do now is I would definitely leave it for a little while. I wouldn't like go back in that direction. I would let that person reach out. Often FAs will do stuff too where they like in theory like the idea of meeting with somebody. And then when the time comes, they feel like they have competing needs or other things going on, and then they withdraw. So that's probably like part of what's happening. And, obviously COVID and all this stuff makes an impact as well. So my advice would be, if you're in that situation, and you're trying to reconnect, if it started as Limerence. Okay, so if you're in that situation, I would definitely pull back and go no contact for a little while. Let that person reach out. I know it's going to be hard, but work on yourself, set boundaries, do all your healing work in the meantime. And then if he doesn't reach out, maybe reach out one more time. But I would wait at least another 2 or 3 weeks. And maybe before you just say, hey, let's spend time together, maybe just re-engage in a conversation a little bit and sort of build up that connection for a week or 2. And then ask one more time. But I would really set hard boundaries with you after that, because you don't want to be in a space where you feel like you're chasing somebody, where you feel like, oh, I really want something to work out here, and then the person's not fully getting that. Like, you want to also hold space for you to feel like you deserve somebody who's showing up the same way you would, who expresses the desires and the things that you want in a relationship dynamic, and like really puts the effort in that makes a relationship dynamic thrive. So I am going to I'll answer 2 last questions. And then I'm also going to give you guys a set of self-reflection questions that are really that are going to be valuable in terms of like identifying your needs ahead of time. And just some things that will sort of help you in this area. So I feel tired of meeting my needs by myself for so long. Is that normal? Ruby, I remember you saying how much you loved meeting your needs for so long, and you are a beautiful example of equilibration. So when you feel like that, okay, I remember when you were like, I'm just going to meet my own needs, and it feels so empowering and I feel so good there. Once you've done that long enough, and once you've started to really get your needs met, then you start to move into a space where, how you guys keep saying like, oh, I'm becoming more avoidant. Is that a part of healing? Yes. But it's because of your perception point more than anything else. But you start building that relationship to yourself, and you'll know when you feel inspired or excited to get your needs met through others, because, okay, I feel like my cup is full meeting my needs for myself, and I don't feel as inspired to do that any longer. And so what this is a signpost of, and thank you, because it's a beautiful model for so many other students, is you've equilibrated a lot. Your relationship to self you found, you really like pushed right into and showed up for. You did a fantastic job and really dove in there, and now you're equilibrating. And part of the next natural step of evolution is to seek to go back out and meet your needs through other people, and then find a really beautiful, healthy balance of both. And so that is my share for you in that area. So CJ says it seems like someone tried to really get the words out quickly. It seems like someone could also have limerence for a relationship if they see partner's flaws, but so strongly want the relationship. Is that possible? Yes, absolutely. Great insight. And the reason for that would be because the relationship is meeting needs. So you might see the flaws, but because because limerence can be based on different things. It can be based on needs. It can be based on trait integration. It can be based on a subconscious comfort zone. So what can happen is you can see the flaws. And so it's less about traits, but the person could be meeting needs, where the idea or concept of a relationship could also be meeting needs. And that's what's creating the limerence. So great question. So Tiny says, sorry if I missed your question. How do you differentiate between limerence and having a hard time letting go? I feel like I have moved through a lot of my breakup, but feel like I'm subconsciously not wanting to let go. I feel like I spend so much of work thinking of the breakup, and the relationship, even though I have done the course and I know this wasn't working. So you know that the focusing on the relationship isn't working is what I hear and understand. And you're asking, how do you differentiate between limerence and having a hard time letting go? I feel like I have moved through a lot of my breakup, but I feel like I'm subconsciously not wanting to let go. So you've answered that question for yourself. You're not wanting to let go. So now what you do is you find out why. What in me is afraid of letting go? So ask yourself, like, if I sit down with a pen and paper, what am I afraid that letting go means? And these are all questions to ask yourself, what are my subconscious associations to letting go and to loss? What am I afraid will not get met if I'm letting go? Because it's not the act of letting go, it's the meaning you give to letting go that's keeping you, right? And it sounds like you've done a lot of the healing and then you're caught on that last part. And so I don't think it's so much limerence, to be honest, by the way you described it. I think it's a lot more about you having fears of letting go because of painful subconscious associations correlated with loss. And those things are activated. And because the brain is more wired to avoid pain than to seek pleasure, instead of seeking that peace out right at the end, you try to hold on to keep safe. And so I would really reflect on what those things are. And then I would question those stories and really work to equilibrate them in the situation. So great question. Hi, Aviel. Can you speak to ways on releasing shame or struggling with limerence? I carry a lot of it along with grief after struggling with it for many years, as I see my acquaintances and friends in secure and healthy relationships. To them, it's just a crush, but it's so much more painful and confusing than that. Okay, beautiful. So Jersey, the loneliness course is coming out this month. It's not out just yet, but very soon. And it's like a deep dive into it. I think you guys will get a lot out of it. So, Aviel, number one, I would like us all to think of a form of self-betrayal is shaming ourselves for something we don't have control of at a time. So if you look and you go back to those moments where you had limerence and you really honestly look at yourself, did you have control? Did you choose consciously as, your fully conscious prefrontal cortex self, like, I want to be in limerence? Or was that just a natural byproduct of trauma you didn't ask for? And I think when we get into a space, and the honest from like a brain structure truth is that when we are in trauma and when we don't have tools to regulate, the things we do are unconscious and we didn't have a choice. The moment we're truly unconscious, we don't have a choice. Once you start becoming more consciously aware, understand your patterns, understand what to do, then that's great. Then you can have a different conversation. But in the past, when we went through and did the things that we did that weren't the highest expression of ourselves or the best choices that we made, a lot of those things are just the brain being triggered, the prefrontal cortex. Like when we have like really strong norepinephrine and cortisol responses, the prefrontal cortex literally gets triggered to like start shutting down and we start acting out from like an amygdala and limbic system reference point. Like we get into like fight or flight, like we're in survival mode. And when we're in that space, we're not making rational decisions. We're not like, yeah, I'm just going to choose to be over limerence and get over it. Like we're literally in trauma and coping. And that's the result of stuff that we probably didn't ask to go through earlier on in life. And so part of like releasing shame is also seeing yourself as a human being and understanding, like, if I really go back to those moments, I didn't know what limerence was. I had lots of unmet needs in childhood, or I have a lot of traits I repressed through trauma. And I'm not going to beat myself up for that any longer. I'm not going to shame myself for that because number one, it's something so many people go through. And number two, it's just a symptom of pain in the past. And what all I can do right now is be kind to myself and understanding to myself and treat myself like a human being and humanize myself and see some of the pain that I went through and understand that, of course, that was going to happen. And of course, I didn't have a say at the time, but now I do. And part of my healing also requires being kind to myself in the process. So I hope that makes sense. I am going to super have to run. I didn't realize what time it is. I'm going to give you guys a quick set of self-reflection questions, but I hope that makes sense. And it's such an important thing. There's also a process. There's like a 5-step process of releasing guilt and shame that is in the, which course is it in? The Transforming Guilt and Shame course. It's the second last module, and it's a really powerful process to sit with. So I also recommend going through that. Okay, so here's a self-reflection exercise about understanding like what your needs are in relationships. So if you experience limerence, you can help isolate those needs better. It's just a set of questions, okay? Question number 1, and you can always come back and replay this. What makes interactions meaningful for me? Okay? So much of like what connection is based off of, or what like not being lonely, what like feeling connected and safe and good in our relationships everywhere, so that we don't over attach to one relationship because of an imbalance, because of lack happening at a subconscious level. So much of what's important is what makes interactions meaningful for me, the quality of connection in all the relationships in my life. If I have great quality connection in 5, 6 other relationships in my life, even 3, right? Even 2 other relationships would be enough to avoid going into limerence, if that includes the relationship to myself, of course, if there's 2 plus me. It's when we're out of relationship to self and we don't have good, strong connections everywhere else because we haven't figured out how to maintain them or how to create them, or sometimes because of circumstantial reasons, that then we are more likely or more prone to becoming limerent. So number 1, what makes interactions meaningful for me? How can I improve the quality of my connections? By understanding what meaningful connection is to me and actively integrating those things. Number 2, what are my favorite relationships in my life in the history of all the relationships I've ever had, and why? What needs did those meet? And what you're doing is you're identifying your needs ahead of time so that you can actively ask for those needs in all of relationships that you have, so that you can actively meet those needs within yourself, or so that if you are limerent and you're like, oh, I know why. It's because of this need that I'm craving. Who do I show up as in those relationships? Because sometimes as well, it's like we can integrate traits, not just because somebody has a trait. This is actually really important. Not because somebody just has a trait that they are expressing, that the subconscious mind is trying to attach to derive a sense of wholeness from, but also because when we're with that person, a trait comes out in us that we like. So maybe you feel disconnected maybe you're a female and you feel disconnected from your feminine energy. Maybe you feel like you had to grow up and be tough and be strong and like turn on like protection mode and not be vulnerable and not receive and like really buckle down and fight back. And maybe you've like kind of repressed a like nurturing part of yourself or a passive part of yourself out of trauma. And then maybe you're in a dynamic or a situation where somebody comes along and you suddenly have that nurturing quality with that person because they provide a safe space for it, because they're in need, and so you nurture, like whatever it is. But it can also be the traits that you integrate as a byproduct of that relationship as well, because those traits show up more in you that you've been missing. Okay. And that's going to show you little hints if there are any missing pieces. When I feel most fulfilled in my relationships, who am I being? What traits are present within me? That's like a deeper dig into that question. What traits and qualities are most meaningful to me from outside of me? What do I crave, desire, infatuate with on a regular basis? What are those patterns? What do I feel most inspired to be around or most connected to in others? And what needs do I deeply desire to receive from others in relationships? Okay, so go through those questions. Those are going to give you like signposts of these things so you can be proactive about not becoming limerent by actively filling your cup with these things ahead of time and knowing these things about yourself. We dig into this a little bit in the loneliness course, and you're going to have like a workbook with those questions and a whole bunch of other things, so that's a tiny, tiny exercise in that course. But that should be useful as well. So thank you guys so much. And I am going to run for the evening. And I just want to say a great big thank you to all of you guys for being here, for showing up, for being such an amazing part of our community. And I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you for all the amazing feedback and shares. And yeah, just a big thank you to everybody. And I hope you have a wonderful night. I'll see you guys on Friday at 12 p.m. Eastern. Yes, Friday at 12 p.m. Eastern. Bye, guys. Thank you. Bye. Thank you, guys.